"If you can open that safe," he said with a smirk, $100 million is yours." The laughter in the boardroom was sharp, echoing like glass breaking. But the girl in the faded blazer didn't laugh. She just stared at the vault in the corner, the same one she'd dusted years ago when no one even knew her name. With quiet certainty, she stepped forward and pressed her hand to the keypad. For numbers. One breath. And when the final click echoed, the billionaire's face turned ghost white. "Before we begin, please like, subscribe and tell me in the comments. Where you watching from? Globe showing Europe, Africa, United States, Canada, UK, Australia, Jamaica." Charleston, South Carolina, had a way of feeling both tired and timeless. The early morning air carried the scent of river water and coffee, the kind of stillness that belonged to people who'd already learned how to survive. For Hannah Reeves, mornings meant motion. She worked at the corner bakery on Rutledge Avenue, where the oven started before sunrise and her day began with flour on her hands. Her coworkers teased her about never taking breaks, but she didn't have that luxury. Bills didn't wait. Rent didn't forgive. And neither did time. Every paycheck had a destination before it even reached her hands. Rent for the one-bedroom apartment she shared with her younger brother, Caleb, groceries, his therapy sessions. Caleb was only 12, still healing from the accident that had taken their mother 2 years earlier. He was the reason Hannah got up every day, even when life felt like an unending test of endurance. But that morning, something different stirred in her chest, a flicker of hope she hadn't felt in years. She'd found a job posting online the night before while Caleb slept. Administrative assistant, Hawthorne Holdings. Competitive salary. Growth potential. To anyone else, it was just another office job. To her, it sounded like a life raft. The name Hawthorne Holdings wasn't new. Years ago, she'd cleaned their downtown building as part of a janitorial contract. Back then, she'd pushed her cart down marble-floored hallways, invisible to the executives who passed her by. She remembered their confident voices, their laughter, the smell of expensive cologne lingering long after they were gone. That world hadn't been hers then. But maybe now it could be. By noon, she'd filled out the application. By evening, she'd been emailed an interview time. She could hardly believe it. The next day, she stood outside the towering glass building on East Bay Street, clutching a thin leather folder with her resume printed on fresh paper. Her blazer was secondhand but pressed. Her shoes were scuffed but clean. And though her heart pounded, her reflection in the glass doors looked composed. Inside, the lobby was a different world. Polished tile, quiet conversations, people moving with purpose. The receptionist gave her a polite but distracted smile and gestured toward the elevators. Her interview was with Graham Hawthorne himself, the CEO, the name behind the empire. In the elevator's reflection, Hannah steadied her breathing. She wasn't supposed to be nervous. She'd worked for years. She'd earned her experience. But this was different. This wasn't just about a job. It was about dignity. When she stepped into the top-floor office, she felt the temperature shift. Graham Hawthorne looked every bit the man she'd imagined. Mid-40s, commanding presence, dark suit, polished confidence. 2 associates flanked him, standing near the windows. He looked up briefly, then down again at his laptop. "You're early," he said without warmth. "I believe in being prepared," Hannah replied quietly. He nodded without looking at her and gestured to the seat across from his desk. The interview began like any other. Questions about her background, skills, references. But something in his tone carried amusement, like he was indulging her rather than evaluating her. When she spoke about her years juggling work and caring for her brother, his eyebrow lifted slightly. "So, no degree?" he asked. She shook her head. Life had other plans. He smiled faintly, not kindly but curiously, the kind of smile rich men give when they think they've already understood you. As she answered the next question, her eyes drifted to the far wall, a built-in steel safe, tall and unmarked. She remembered it instantly. Years ago, she'd cleaned around it while the elder Mr. Hawthorne, Graham's late father, still ran the company. He was kind, old-fashioned, the sort who always said thank you. She remembered one night hearing him dictate the safe's code to his assistant. It wasn't random numbers, it was a date. The date of his wedding anniversary. She hadn't thought about it in years. But now, as she sat across from his son, cold, self-assured, untouchable, that memory flickered like a candle in her mind. Then came the moment that would change everything. He leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. "You've got heart, I'll give you that," he said. "But I need someone who understands this world, who knows what it takes to build it." He gestured toward the safe with a half-smile. "Tell you what," he said lightly, his tone dripping with mock challenge. "You open that safe and the job's yours. Actually, make it interesting, $100 million too." His associates laughed immediately. The kind of laughter that isn't about humor, but about power. For a moment, she thought he was testing her composure. Maybe he was trying to see if she'd play along. But something inside her didn't find it funny. She looked at him, then at the safe. She stood slowly, her heels quiet on the hardwood. The laughter faded a little when she didn't sit back down. Her hands shook slightly as she brushed the dust from the keypad. It looked the same, unchanged, untouched, like time had waited for this very moment. She exhaled once. Then, steady and deliberate, she entered the code she had never meant to remember. For numbers. The year his parents had married. The pause. The sound echoed in the room like a gunshot. The laughter stopped instantly. The two associates exchanged glances. Graham froze, color draining from his face. No one spoke. The air was thick, the kind of silence that has weight. Hannah stepped back, eyes wide, unsure what she had just done, only certain that something irreversible had begun. The billionaire's expression hardened, confusion flickering into disbelief. And in that long, stunned silence, one question hung between them. How did she know? For several long seconds, no one moved. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the air conditioner and the dull echo of that impossible click. The billionaire's smirk was gone. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. He looked at the safe, then at Hannah, the young woman who shouldn't have known its secret. His associates stood frozen near the window, shifting uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh again or stay silent. Finally, one of them, a tall man in a blue suit, muttered, "Is that real?" Graham Hawthorne stepped forward slowly, his polished shoes whispering against the floor. He touched the safe handle like someone reaching toward a live wire. He turned it, and the door opened with a metallic groan. Inside, stacks of documents, a few velvet pouches, and one small, framed photograph sat neatly on the shelf. He stared at the photo first, an old black and white image of a wedding day. His parents, smiling. The same date etched into his father's cufflinks. He exhaled through his nose, sharp and unsteady. Then his eyes darted back to Hannah. "How did you?" He stopped himself. The question sounded too exposed, too personal. Hannah didn't speak. She didn't even seem to breathe. "Finally," he said quietly, "that code hasn't been used in 15 years. The two associates looked between them, clearly unsettled. "Mr. Hawthorne," one began, but Graham cut him off with a wave of his hand. "You can both leave." They hesitated, but one look at his face made them obey. The door shut behind them, leaving Hannah and the billionaire alone. The silence was heavy again, not awkward, but charged. Graham studied her, almost dissecting her expression. "You've been here before," he said. She nodded once. "Years ago." He took a few steps closer. "You worked here?" "Not like this," she said softly. "I cleaned this floor when your father was alive." For a moment, something shifted in his face. Confusion, then disbelief. "My father knew every employee." "He didn't." "He did," Hannah interrupted, quietly but firmly. "He used to talk to me sometimes when he stayed late. He told me stories about this company, about how it started. He said this place was built on trust. I believed him." Graham looked away, his jaw tightening. That word, trust, seemed to hit him somewhere he didn't want to be touched. Then his voice hardened again. "So what, you remembered a random code from a man you mopped floors for 15 years ago? That's supposed to impress me?" Hannah flinched slightly but didn't back down. "No. It's supposed to remind you who you used to be before the money started talking louder than your conscience." that landed like a slap. For a brief second, something broke through the billionaire's practiced composure, anger, maybe, or something darker. But he quickly smoothed it over with a cold smile. "Well," he said, turning away. "Congratulations, Ms. Reeves. You've officially made this interview unforgettable." She didn't move. "So, what now?" He looked back at her, eyes unreadable. Now I have to figure out if you're a threat or a miracle." He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Security? Bring up HR. We need to update a candidate's file." The call ended before she could respond. He walked around his desk, calm on the outside but clearly unsettled inside. "You can wait outside," he said. Hannah stood still for a moment. "Do I still have the job?" He hesitated, too long. "Then, we'll be in touch." The words cut deeper than he probably meant them to. She nodded quietly, picked up her folder, and left the office. The elevator ride down felt longer than before. Her reflection in the mirrored walls didn't look victorious or proud, just exhausted. Maybe she'd pushed too far. Maybe she'd just ruined her one real chance. Outside, the Charleston afternoon burned bright and humid. She walked to the bus stop, clutching her bag, trying to convince herself it didn't matter, that she tried, that it was enough. But deep down, she knew something had shifted upstairs. Inside that glass tower, Graham Hawthorne sat alone at his desk, staring at the open safe. He couldn't shake her words, or the way she'd known the code. He pulled out the photograph again. His father's handwriting on the back read, "Never forget why you started." He hadn't looked at that photo in years. It had been easier not to. There was something haunting about the way that girl had spoken, not with arrogance, but with conviction. Like someone who'd lived at the edges of other people's privilege long enough to see the truth of it. He opened his laptop, intending to move on with his day, but couldn't concentrate. Instead, he typed her name into the employee records archive. There it was, Hannah Reeves, cleaning staff, 2010 to 2011, night shift. A single note under comments caught his attention. Reliable, attentive, polite. Always hums while working. His father's signature beside it. For the first time in a long time, Graham felt something like regret. That night, while Hannah cooked dinner for Caleb, she tried not to replay the interview in her mind. He'd probably already forgotten her name. That was how people like him worked. But as she set the plates down, her phone buzzed. A known number. She almost ignored it, then answered. "Ms. Reeves?" a woman's voice asked. "This is from Hawthorne Holdings. Mr. Hawthorne has requested a second meeting. Tomorrow morning." Her hand froze around the phone. "A second meeting?" "Yes. His office. 9 a.m. The call ended before she could ask why. She stood in the kitchen, stunned. Caleb looked up from his plate. "You okay?" She smiled faintly. I think so." But deep down, she wasn't sure. The next morning, she returned to the same glass building, same elevator, same lobby, but a different weight in her chest. When she walked into the office this time, Graham was standing by the window. The safe was still open behind him. He turned when she entered. "Close the door," he said. The tone was firm, but not unkind. She did. He studied her quietly. "Do you believe in coincidences, Ms. Reeves?" She frowned slightly. "Not really." "Neither do I," he said. "My father used that same phrase, trust and conscience, almost word for word in his last company memo before he died." Her eyes softened. "He meant it." He nodded slowly. "He did. And maybe I've forgotten that." He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "You opened that safe, and I don't even care how. What matters is why you remembered." She looked at him, unsure how to answer. "I'm giving you a temporary position," he said finally. "Prove to me you're worth keeping. You start tomorrow." Hannah didn't know whether to thank him or question his motives. But either way, the decision had been made. As she left the office, she caught one last glimpse of the open safe, the photo of his parents still inside, gleaming in the light. Something told her this wasn't the end of a test. It was only the beginning of one neither of them understood yet. Because somewhere beneath that polished office and buried grief, Graham Hawthorne had just hired the one woman who could unravel everything he'd built, including himself. The next morning, Hannah arrived at Hawthorne Holdings long before sunrise. The city streets were still quiet, mist curling around the lampposts like faint memory. She carried the same worn-out bag she'd used for years, its corners frayed, but inside was something new, a company ID card that bore her name. It didn't feel real. The receptionist gave her a nod of recognition this time. Not a polite stranger's nod, a professional one. That small difference meant more than she'd ever admit. Her new desk was near the back of the operations floor, tucked beside a window that overlooked the harbor. The office buzzed with restrained energy, phones ringing, keyboards clacking, people with coffee cups walking too fast. She didn't mind being invisible here. She'd learned long ago that people revealed the most when they thought no one was listening. By noon, she'd already sorted through a week's worth of backlog, organized old contracts, and caught 2 errors the department head had missed. Efficiency came naturally to her. Survival had taught her how to do more with less. Around lunchtime, she felt someone watching. When she looked up, Graham Hawthorne was standing a few steps away. He didn't say anything at first. Just observed, his eyes searching her face like he was still trying to understand who she really was. "You work fast," he finally said. "I've had practice," she replied simply. He nodded. "Walk with me." They moved down the hallway toward the upper offices, where the hum of the floor faded into quiet conversation and closed doors. He led her into a conference room overlooking the bay, bright water glinting in the distance, seagulls looping through the air. He rested his hands on the back of a chair. "Do you know why I brought you back?" She hesitated. "Because I opened the safe?" He almost smiled, then shook his head. "No. Because you said something that's been stuck in my head since that day." She waited. He met her eyes. "You said I used to know who I was. That my conscience used to speak louder than money. You couldn't have known how right you were." For the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like one who'd lost something along the way. He turned toward the window. "When my father died, this company changed. I changed. I told myself I was protecting his legacy, but somewhere in there, I started protecting my own pride instead." Hannah stayed silent. Some truths didn't need commentary. He continued, voice lower now. "I looked into your file. You were cleaning this building the week my father passed. He must have trusted you enough to let you near that office." "He treated everyone with respect," she said softly, "even people who had nothing to offer him." He nodded, almost bitterly. "Yeah, that was his problem, and his gift." Then he turned to her. "So tell me, Hannah, what would you do differently if you were me?" The question caught her off guard. No one like him had ever asked her something like that. "I'd start by remembering the people who can't afford to make mistakes," she said. "Because they're the ones who build what people like you get credit for." Her words hung between them, gentle, but heavy with truth. He didn't reply immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed a folded paper on the table. "Do you know what this is?" he asked. She shook her head. "It's a letter my father wrote to me before he died. It was locked inside that safe, the one you opened." Hannah's breath caught. "I didn't even know it existed until yesterday," he said quietly. "You didn't just unlock metal. You unlocked something I was too proud to face." He unfolded the paper and slid it across to her. The handwriting was delicate, fading at the edges. She didn't mean to read it, but the first lines drew her eyes. "Son, if you ever forget that this company is made of people, not profits, remember the janitor who stayed late that night so you could finish your report. Remember her kindness. She's worth more than any deal you'll ever sign." Hannah's eyes widened. Her throat tightened. "Your father, he was talking about me," she whispered. Graham nodded slowly. "Seems that way." The realization hit her like a tide, all those nights sweeping empty halls while the old man worked, thinking she'd been invisible. He'd seen her, remembered her. And now, somehow, that memory had found its way back through his son. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, softly, Graham said, "You reminded me what kind of man he wanted me to be." She smiled faintly. Then maybe this was never about a job. He looked at her with something new in his expression, not pity, not arrogance. Respect. The days that followed changed everything. Graham started visiting the lower floors more often. He spoke to the staff by name. He asked questions, listened, even when the answers weren't flattering. The company began to shift, slowly but noticeably. And Hannah? She became something like a bridge between two worlds, the one that worked in silence and the one that gave the orders. People trusted her instantly. She had that effect, calm, grounded, unpretentious. But not everyone approved. One afternoon, she overheard a pair of executives whispering near the break room. "You know she's only here because of that stunt with the safe, right?" one said. "She's not one of us." Hannah didn't respond. She'd been called worse things by better people. Still, their words lingered. And when Graham invited her to attend an executive meeting later that week, she hesitated. She wasn't afraid of the boardroom. She was afraid of the looks she'd get once she stepped inside it. When the meeting began, she sat quietly at the far end of the table while a dozen suits argued over quarterly reports. Halfway through, an older board member, Mr. Pierce, turned toward her. "And who is this again?" Graham leaned back. "The reason we're still standing," he said evenly. The room fell silent for a beat, and Hannah realized the power of being seen. But that silence wouldn't last. Later that day, she received an anonymous email with one sentence: "You don't belong here." She stared at the screen for a long time. She could have deleted it, could have ignored it, but instead she forwarded it to Graham. He called her into his office within minutes. When she arrived, he didn't look angry. He looked protective. "They won't run you out," he said firmly. "Not after everything you've done." She looked at him carefully. "Why does it matter so much to you?" He paused, then said, almost to himself, "Because for once, doing the right thing doesn't feel like a loss." That night, alone in her apartment, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was shifting, not just in the company, but between them. For years, she'd worked in shadows. Now, she was standing in light that wasn't supposed to reach her. And Graham, the man who once mocked her, was beginning to see through his own reflection. Still, every light casts a shadow. And before this story was over, both of theirs would collide in a way neither could have imagined. Because sometimes, the moment you start rebuilding your life is exactly when someone else begins to test how far you're willing to go to protect it. By the end of that week, Hawthorne Holdings felt like a different company. People noticed it, from the front desk clerk who no longer whispered when the CO passed, to the janitors who found new cleaning supplies waiting without being asked. For the first time in years, employees felt seen. And though they didn't know it, most of those changes came from Hannah. She'd quietly rewritten internal processes, reorganized payroll fairness reviews, even set up a mentorship rotation between executives and staff, an idea Graham had hesitated to approve but now proudly presented as his own initiative. But change always came with resistance. The board of directors wasn't happy. Behind closed doors, some of the company's oldest members started to question his judgment. They whispered about favoritism, instability, sentimentality. And at the center of it all was Hannah Reeves, the girl who'd come from nowhere and somehow turned the company's pulse upside down. One Friday afternoon, while Hannah was sorting files in the operations wing, she overheard two voices coming from the adjacent conference room. "She's changing things too fast," one man said. "The staff's getting ideas. They think this is a democracy." "And Graham's letting it happen," the other replied. "He hasn't been himself since that woman showed up. If this continues, we'll lose control of the narrative." Hannah froze, file in hand. She hadn't meant to listen, but the words cut through the glass wall like smoke. "She's temporary," one of them added. "Sooner or later, people like her always are." The phrase hit harder than it should have, not because it wasn't true, but because deep down she feared they might be right. That night, she stayed late, working quietly while the building emptied. Around 9, Graham walked in. He looked tired, not the physical kind, but the kind that seeps into a man's confidence. "You shouldn't be here this late," he said. "Someone has to make sure things actually work," she replied with a faint smile. He leaned against the doorway. "I heard what they said." She looked up sharply. "I know about the board," he continued. "They think you're manipulating me." She sighed, closing the folder. "And are they wrong?" He stepped closer. "You know they are." For a moment, the room was still. The only sound was the distant hum of city lights outside the window. "I didn't come here to change your company," she said softly. "I came because I needed a job. Everything else just happened." "I know," he said. "And that's the problem." She frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then ran a hand over his face. "You reminded me of what my father built, what I destroyed trying to outgrow his shadow. The board sees that as weakness. And if they move against me, they'll drag you down first." Her chest tightened. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying I need to protect you, even if that means pushing you away for now." The words sank like stones in water. "You're firing me," she said quietly. He shook his head. "No. Just moving you to a different department until things settle. You'll still be paid the same." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the guilt hiding beneath his calm expression. "You're doing this for them," she said. "I'm doing this to keep you safe." "Safe from what, Graham? From their opinion, or from yours?" He didn't answer. The silence between them wasn't anger. It was disappointment, the kind that comes when you realize even the people trying to do right still fall short when it counts. She gathered her things without another word. When she reached the door, he said softly, "Hannah." But she didn't turn around. The following week felt heavier. The office air grew tense, conversations clipped. Hannah's reassignment placed her in an isolated data role, away from people, away from influence. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered that she'd been caught overstepping boundaries. Others said she was leaving soon anyway. She ignored them all. But deep down, a quiet ache settled in her chest, not for the job, but for the faith she'd started to place in him. Meanwhile, Graham tried to convince himself it was the right decision. He'd spent nights reviewing board reports, crafting new statements, even planning a restructuring meant to keep both sides satisfied. But nothing worked. Every success felt hollow. And then one evening, a file landed on his desk, an anonymous internal audit report. He flipped it open and froze. At the top was his father's signature, scanned from an old policy file, the one that had been stored inside that safe years ago. Attached to it was a handwritten note in his father's familiar script. "Integrity cannot survive in silence." The timestamp read 2011, the same year Hannah had worked there. And beneath the note, one more line was typed in. "Final revision completed by H. Reeves." Graham stared at the name, realization sinking in like gravity. She hadn't just cleaned the building. She'd helped rewrite one of the company's founding ethics policies, something his father must have asked her to do privately when no one else would. Everything she'd done since walking back into his office suddenly made sense. She wasn't trying to change him. She was trying to finish what his father started. He didn't wait. By morning, he was in her new department, ignoring the confused looks of staff as he approached her workstation. "You wrote this," he said, holding up the file. She blinked in surprise. "Where did you get that?" "My father's archive," he said. "You helped him write this code of conduct before he died." She looked down at the paper. "He asked me to type it up after hours. Said he didn't trust the board to handle it right." "And you never mentioned it?" "Who was going to believe me?" she said quietly. "I was just the janitor." He stared at her for a long time. "You've been carrying my father's legacy longer than I have." She shook her head. "It's not about legacy, Graham. It's about memory, keeping what's good alive even when people forget." The weight of her words hit him harder than any business failure ever had. He exhaled slowly, almost shaking his head in disbelief. "You were never temporary, Hannah." "I was." That night, he called an emergency board meeting. No assistants, no lawyers, just the core members and him. He placed the old ethics document in the center of the table. "This," he said, voice steady, "is what my father wanted for this company. And the woman you've been undermining was the only one who remembered it." The boardroom went silent. And as he spoke, the tension that had been choking the company began to loosen, but not without consequence. Because when truth rises, pride falls. And not everyone was ready to let go of power so easily. Outside the boardroom that night, Hannah waited by the window, unaware that one man in that meeting was already planning to undo everything, starting with her. The board meeting stretched late into the night. Rain tapped faintly against the windows, though inside, the tension was louder than any storm. Graham Hawthorne stood at the head of the table, his father's ethics document laid open before the men who had spent years reshaping his company into something colder. "This is where we lost ourselves," he said quietly. "The policies changed, the numbers grew, but the soul of this place disappeared." No one responded. Some leaned back in discomfort. Others crossed their arms, waiting for him to finish. He continued, voice steady. "My father trusted this company to people who would protect its principles. But it turns out, the only person who actually did was the woman you tried to push out." A few glances shifted uncomfortably. Graham picked up the document. "You've accused her of manipulating me. You've said she's temporary. You've called her unqualified. But what she's done in 3 months has rebuilt more trust than any of us did in 3 years." He paused. "If that's a threat to you, maybe the problem isn't her." One of the board members, Pierce, adjusted his tie. "You're letting sentiment cloud your leadership," he said curtly. "Business isn't built on emotions." Graham looked him straight in the eye. "No, it's built on integrity. And without that, it's just numbers on a dying balance sheet." For the first time, there was no laughter in the boardroom, only quiet reckoning. He signed the bottom of the document. "Effective immediately," he said, "this policy will be reinstated. Every employee will be treated with the fairness my father built this company on. And anyone who can't stand by that can step down." Pierce gathered his papers, muttering something under his breath, and left the room. 2 others followed. It didn't matter. The message had already landed. The next morning, the office felt lighter. The tension that had shadowed the halls seemed to ease, replaced by cautious hope. When Hannah arrived, she noticed people smiling again, not out of obligation, but relief. Then she saw Graham standing by the front reception. He was waiting for her. "Walk with me," he said. They stepped outside, the Charleston air warm and humid, sunlight filtering through the trees. "I told them everything," he said quietly. "About my father. About you. About the code." She didn't respond right away. She just looked at him, searching for truth behind his calm tone. "They're not going to like it," she said finally. "They don't have to," he replied. "I didn't do it for them." He stopped walking and turned toward her. "You were right all along. I forgot why I started. I lost sight of what mattered. You reminded me." Hannah smiled faintly. "Sometimes it takes falling apart to see what was holding you together." They stood there for a moment. 2 people from opposite worlds, both changed by the same truth. Weeks passed. The company began transforming from the inside out. Fairer wages, open-door policies, mentorship programs that bridged hierarchy gaps. Things once considered impossible were now standard. And at the center of it all was Hannah, now promoted to Director of People and Ethics, a title she never imagined she'd hold. Every decision she made echoed her mother's old advice. Don't fight to be seen. Fight to make a difference. Her brother Caleb, now thriving in school, started saying he wanted to work for the lady who changed the rules. Sometimes, when she passed the old boardroom, she'd see Graham there, sleeves rolled up, focused, lighter somehow. Not the same man who once mocked a janitor, but someone humbled by his own awakening. He'd started visiting the lower floors again, shaking hands, remembering names. Some said he'd gone soft. Others said he'd finally grown up. But those who worked closest to him, especially Hannah, knew the truth. He'd finally become his father's son. One afternoon, Graham called Hannah into his office. On his desk sat a small, gift-wrapped box. "For you," he said. Inside was a brass key. She looked at him, puzzled. "What's this for?" He smiled. "The safe. I changed the code. But I want you to have a key to it. Because the person who taught me what trust really means should always have access to it." For a moment, her composure cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "Thank you," she said softly, "for remembering." He nodded. "No. Thank you for reminding me." Months later, at the company's annual gathering, Graham stepped on stage to make a public announcement. He shared the story, not of profits, not of innovation, but of humility. He told them about his father's letter, about the janitor who remembered a code no one else knew, about the moment pride met grace and lost. And as he finished, he looked directly at Hannah sitting in the front row and said, "This company was never built by one man. It was rebuilt by someone who refused to forget what decency looks like." The crowd rose in applause. And for the first time in a long while, Hannah didn't feel like a visitor in someone else's world. She felt home. Later that night, as she walked through the quiet hallways, she passed the safe, now sitting open, the framed wedding photo still inside. She smiled and whispered, "You'd be proud of him." Then she turned off the lights and walked out into the Charleston evening, calm, steady, and free. Sometimes, the tests life gives us aren't about wealth or skill. They're about remembering who we were before the world told us to forget. A billionaire taught a poor girl a cruel joke, but she turned it into a lesson he'd never unlearn. Integrity doesn't come from status. It comes from memory. In the end, she didn't open that safe for money. She opened it to remind him of what his father stood for, and in doing so, she saved not just a company, but his soul. Broken heart, if stories like this still mean something to you, don't just scroll past. Subscribe. Not for me, but because in a world that's losing its empathy, stories like this are one of the few things keeping it alive.